August 24, 1814. The British Army, the strongest force in the world, walked right into the president's house. They didn't come to talk, they came to win. Finding a fancy victory feast still sitting on the table, originally made for President James Madison, they sat down and ate it themselves. Once they were full, they didn't leave a thank you note. Instead, they piled up the furniture, grabbed torches, and set the whole room on fire. Looking at the White House today, it's hard to imagine it as anything but a grand palace. But back then, it wasn't a symbol of a superpower. It was just a gray house sitting in the middle of a hot, stinking, mosquito-filled swamp. In fact, most people hated the idea of living there. It was damp, it was lonely, and in 1814, it was nothing more than a blackened ruin. This brings us to a strange mystery. How did a building made of soft, crumbling stone survive fire, rot, and the fall of empires? How did a house that almost nobody wanted become the most famous address on Earth? To find the answer, we have to look past the white paint and see the scars hidden underneath. To understand how this famous house began, we have to strip away the paved roads and the glowing streetlights. We have to go back to a time when the air didn't smell like car exhaust, but like damp earth and salty river water. Long before the first brick was laid, this land belonged to the Natchitoches people. They lived along the banks of the Potomac River, fishing in the deep blue water and hunting in the thick green forests. To them, this wasn't a political center, it was a home provided by nature. Even today, pieces of that old world are hiding right under our feet. Beneath the heavy concrete of Washington, D.C., a hidden waterway called Tiber Creek still flows through dark pipes. In the early days, this creek was a wild, rushing stream that cut through the landscape. It is a ghostly reminder that before the city was built, the land was a wild tangle of nature that didn't want to be tamed. Then came a man with a massive dream. Pierre L'Enfant was a French architect who looked at this messy, mosquito-filled swamp and saw a new Rome. He didn't want a small village, he wanted a city of giants. He drew a grid of wide, grand streets over the mud and forests, planning a place where every road led to something magnificent. He imagined stone pillars, great domes, and a sense of power that would last for 1,000 years. But building a Rome on the Potomac was easier said than done. The ground was soft, the weather was punishing, and the task was so big it seemed impossible. The workers weren't just fighting against stone and timber, they were fighting against the swamp itself. They had to pull a city out of the muck using nothing but sweat, grit, and a kind of soft sandstone that seemed far too weak to hold up the weight of a new nation's dreams. This was the birth of a legend, built on a foundation of mud and big ideas. While the dream of a grand city was being drawn on paper, the leaders of the young United States were arguing about where to put it. At the time, big cities like Philadelphia and New York were the centers of life. They had the best shops, the biggest docks, and the most people. But the new government was nervous. They didn't want their capital to be stuck in a place that already had its own rules and powerful families. They wanted a neutral zone, a patch of land that didn't belong to any one group, where the nation could start fresh. The decision didn't happen in a public court or a crowded hall. Instead, it happened behind a closed door over a quiet dinner in 1790. Three men, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton, sat down to strike a deal. Between bites of food and sips of wine, they traded secrets and votes. Hamilton wanted the government to handle the country's debts, while Jefferson and Madison wanted the capital moved to the south. By the time the meal was over, they had a plan. They would build the capital on the banks of the Potomac, right in that damp, difficult swamp we talked about. In 1792, it was finally time to make that promise real. A small group gathered in the woods to lay the very first cornerstone of the president's house. There were no cheering crowds or giant parades. It was a quiet, humble moment. As that heavy block of stone was lowered into the dirt, it represented more than just a wall. It was a silent promise made by a fragile new nation that was barely holding itself together. They were betting everything on the idea that they could build something permanent in a world that expected them to fail. They were planting a seed in the mud, hoping it would one day grow into something the rest of the world would have to respect. That promise of a new nation was almost broken just 20 years later. In the summer of 1814, a massive shadow fell over the coast. The British Navy, the Goliath of the seas, sailed up the Potomac River with one goal: to crush the American spirit. When they met the American militia at the Battle of Bladensburg, it wasn't much of a fight. The young American soldiers were mostly farmers and shopkeepers, not trained warriors. Panicked by the sight of the professional British Army, they turned and ran, leaving the road to Washington wide open. By the time the British reached the president's house, they found a ghost town. They feasted on the food left behind, then lit their torches. The orange glow of the fire could be seen for miles as the wooden floors and expensive furniture turned to ash. It looked like the end, but just as the flames were devouring the house, the sky turned a bruised purple. In a strange twist of fate, nature stepped in. A massive hurricane and a rare tornado ripped through the city. The wind was so strong it knocked over British cannons, and the heavy rain poured down like a waterfall, soaking the fires until they sputtered out. The invincible British Army, shaken by the terrifying storm, retreated to their ships. The next morning, the city was a graveyard of smoke and wet ash. Most people in Europe believed the American experiment was over. They thought no nation could survive having its heart burned out. But the Americans didn't give up. Instead of tearing down the ruined building, they scrubbed the blackened stones and covered the ugly burn marks with thick, bright white paint. It was a clever way to hide the scars of defeat. The house wasn't just a building anymore. It was a survivor. It stood tall, dressed in white, proving to the world that even though they had been beaten and burned, they were still standing. As the years rolled by, the house began to change along with the country. It was no longer just a place where a family lived. It was turning into a giant command center for the entire world. To keep up with all the work, leaders added the east and west wings. These weren't just extra rooms. They were the engines of a new kind of power. The building was transforming from a simple home into a global symbol. It became the place where big ideas about freedom were sent out to every corner of the map. People everywhere started to recognize its shape, seeing it as a beacon of hope and strength. But by 1948, the famous house was hiding a scary secret. While it looked strong on the outside, the inside was literally falling apart. When President Harry Truman moved in, he noticed the floors were shaking. One day, a heavy piano leg actually broke through the ceiling of the room below. The old wooden beams, tired from over 100 years of weight and fire damage, were finally giving up. If they didn't do something fast, the whole thing was going to crash down into a pile of dust. Instead of moving out and building something new, Truman decided to do something bold. He didn't want to lose the history held within those white stone walls. Workers moved in and hollowed out the entire building until it was just an empty shell. They took out every floor, every wall, and every bathtub, leaving nothing but the outer stone skin standing. Then, they built a brand new steel frame inside the old walls. This massive project proved something incredible. The idea of the White House was more important than the actual wood and bricks inside it. By keeping the scarred, painted shell and filling it with a heart of steel, they made sure the house could stand forever. It was a message to the world that even when the insides are crumbling, the spirit of the home can be rebuilt stronger than ever before. Even after the house was rebuilt, its greatest test was still to come. In the 1860s, the country was tearing itself apart over the terrible reality of slavery. The White House sat right on the edge of the fight, a lonely island of the North surrounded by the South. At night, President Abraham Lincoln would climb up to the roof and look out into the darkness. Just across the Potomac River, he could see the glowing orange dots of enemy campfires. The war wasn't far away in some distant land. It was right at his front door, watching him. Inside the house, the tension was thick enough to feel. Yet, even as the nation split in two, Lincoln refused to turn the mansion into a locked fortress. He believed it belonged to the citizens. One famous story tells of a tired, dusty soldier who had wandered into the White House hallways, hoping for a moment of rest. Instead of being chased away by guards, he ran right into the president himself. Lincoln didn't act like a king or a distant ruler. He stopped, spoke to the young man like a neighbor, and listened to his troubles. It was a small moment, but it showed that the people's house was still open to the people, even in the middle of a bloody war. Lincoln knew that if the house fell, the idea of America might fall with it. He spent long, sleepless nights walking the floors, weighed down by the heavy cost of the fighting. His message was clear: The Union had to be kept together, no matter how hard the struggle became. The white walls of the mansion stood as a reminder that a house divided against itself cannot stand. It became a symbol of a promise that had to be kept, that one day, the fires would go out, the campfires across the river would vanish, and the nation would be whole again. As the world moved into the middle of the 20th century, the White House took on a new, darker role. It was no longer just a home or a place for dinners. It became a global watchtower. During the Cold War, the threat of nuclear fire hung over the planet like a heavy cloud. Deep inside the house, leaders created the Situation Room, a secret, high-tech command center where the president could watch the world in real time. The house became a bunker that never slept, filled with glowing screens and hushed voices, waiting for a signal that might never come. While the streets outside stayed quiet, the people inside were watching the entire globe, ready to protect the nation at a moment's notice. However, the peace didn't last long on the outside. By the 1960s, the world was changing again, and the anger of the people began to knock on the front door. Huge crowds of protesters gathered on the lawn, their voices rising like a storm against the stone walls. For the first time, the People's House felt like it was under siege from its own citizens. The simple iron fence, which used to be easy to see through, started to feel more like a giant wall. The house that was meant to be open and welcoming was now pulling back, trying to keep the chaos of the outside world from forcing its way in. In the middle of all this tension, a very important rule was added to the law books, the 22nd Amendment. This rule made it official that no president could stay in the House for more than 2 terms. It was a powerful choice that changed everything. It made sure that no matter how famous or strong a leader became, they were only temporary guests. The House itself was the true power, and the person inside was just a worker passing through. By limiting the man, the law made the House bigger and more permanent. It proved that while presidents come and go like the seasons, the White House remains, a steady, white stone guardian watching over the future. Today, the White House stands at the very center of a massive web of power. If you stand on its lawn, you are only a short distance from the Treasury, where the nation's money is managed, and the Pentagon, where the world's most powerful military is led. Inside the house itself, a leather briefcase known as the nuclear football is never far from the president's side. This bag holds the codes that could change the world in a heartbeat. The quiet, gray house in the swamp has truly become the heart of a global giant, pulsing with energy and decisions that reach across every ocean. But even with all this power, the house carries heavy shadows from its past. We cannot look at its beautiful white walls without remembering the stains that history left behind. The very stones were cut and hauled by enslaved people who were never given the freedom they were building for others. Within these rooms, leaders have made difficult and sometimes painful choices to start wars that cost many lives. These memories are part of the building, too. They remind us that the house isn't just a place of glory. It is a place of great responsibility and human cost. In the end, the story of the White House is a story about a servant, not a master. It was built to serve the people, to house their leaders, and to stand as a witness to their struggles. It has survived being burned to the ground, falling apart from rot, and the weight of a million secrets. It remains a simple house made of soft stone, painted white to hide its scars. It reminds us that while the people inside will always change, the house stands firm. It is a symbol that power belongs to the citizens, and as long as those walls are standing, the promise of the nation is still alive. If you were to walk up to the White House today and scrape away the thick layers of bright white paint, you would find something incredible underneath. You would see the dark, charred marks of the fire from 1814. Those black scars are still there, hidden in the soft sandstone, resting like a secret memory. The house has lived through fire, survived the rot of a swamp, and held together while the country almost tore itself apart. It has been hollowed out and rebuilt with steel, but it never lost its soul. It stands as an eternal anchor in a world that never stops shifting. We often think of it as a palace for the powerful, but it is actually more like a lighthouse. A palace is built to show off wealth and keep people out, but a lighthouse is built to guide people through a storm. For over 200 years, this building has been the light that stays on while the rest of the world goes dark. It reminds us that even when things feel like they are falling apart, we can rebuild. We can scrub away the soot, paint over the damage, and stand back up stronger than we were before. The White House has seen every tear, every victory, and every secret of the American story. It has watched empires rise and leaders fall, all while remaining a steady, silent witness. It makes you wonder about everything those stones have heard behind closed doors. If these walls could finally talk, which secret do you think they would tell us first? There are so many more hidden stories buried in the pages of history, just waiting to be uncovered. Subscribe and join us as we dive back into the past to find them.